Welcome to the Inheritance Podcast. I'm Joe Riley. Today we are speaking once again with Dr. James Grubman, an internationally recognized consultant to families of wealth, family businesses, and the advisors who serve them. He is the co-author of one of the buzziest books of the year called Wealth 3.0, The Future of Family Wealth Advising, along with Dennis Jaffe and Kristin Keffeler, who I have also interviewed previously on this podcast. I wanted to talk to Jim and get some more color on his attitudes towards wealth advising, the issues with the literature and research in the space, how to escape from a fear-based mindset to one of growth around wealth, and why everyone does not necessarily want to create a dynasty. Please enjoy my excellent conversation with Jim Grubman.
This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Anything said by the guests or host should not be construed as legal or investment advice. Thanks for listening.
We should probably take a quick run through Wealth 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0 for the listeners who aren't familiar with the terms.
Essentially, this all came from a keynote address I did at the Purposeful Planning Institute Rendezvous in 2019, actually exactly 4 years ago, in which I tried to put context to understanding the field. And the way that I summarized it was that prior to about 1980 or so, plus or minus, we were in Wealth 1.0. And that it was the era of very little written or discussed in any good or formal way about psychology of wealth and families. It was more about dynastic wealth. The books that were written were about dynastic families, and whatever was discussed and worked on with wealth and families was at the private banking level. The entire wealth management industry was much simpler and different for the centuries leading up to the 1980 period. And it was mostly about the money. The activities for private bankers, attorneys, those who served the ultra-high net worth population was largely around preserving and protecting the money. The wealth management industry, as we know it in the U.S. in particular, and maybe we can also take a moment later and talk about the world, really began as a result of a lot of legislative and regulatory changes that occurred in the late 1970s and 1980s that opened up the industry tremendously. And so between 1980, 85, 88, and now, because Wealth 2.0 is still very much with us, it built all the things that we pretty much discuss and rely on, including the huge, wonderful development of the understanding of family wealth that we still benefit from in many ways. And probably most emblematic of that is the work of J. Hughes, who is the father of the field in many ways, and just did tremendous things in what we now talk about of the many capitals of the family, understanding families of affinity, and how there's a whole generational cohort of the last 40 years that built the principles that we often rely on. In the keynote and now in the book, what we also talk about is that gradually growing up around the good parts of Wealth 2.0 have been some not so good parts. Emphasis on you better do these things or your family will suffer from the curse of shirt sleeve to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The research, which largely dates back to the 1980s, most people don't know about that, was really not very good research design and has very limited applicability in the modern world. And just a variety of things that grew up around Wealth 2.0 that have undermined its effectiveness. And that then leads to what I termed 3.0 that we are moving into now, which is the rise of positive psychology, strengths-based approaches, doing things by purpose rather than out of fear, and that we may be moving into a new era that keeps the good stuff of what happened in the last 40 years, drops away some of the bad stuff that grew up around it, and moves forward with new learning and new perspective that's going to take it forward in a much better way.
Maybe we should start with a fundamental issue, which I think the book asks, and I'll ask you, what is the difference between the ultra high net worth industry and the field that's grown up around it? Can we put a name to that field? And what is the tension between the two?
I think you used two words there that often are perceived as interchangeable, but they're really not, which is industry and field. There's the field of medicine or psychology, and there's the industry of healthcare. And it's very important to keep the two distinguished, even though they relate to similar things. One is the service side and the delivery of services that is a business, as well as an industry related to how people are trained, various sorts of things. The field, though, is independent of the service delivery. It has to do with the concepts, the research, the principles, the ethics, the activities of the practitioners, independent of things like business models, who is being served, gaps in the industry that then can create gaps in the field. So part of why we wrote the book was to really bring out and clarify the industry of family wealth advising versus the field that needs to become family wealth advising.
So you consider the field family wealth advising?
I do. And the book really clarifies several things about that. One is it really reinforces family wealth advising needs to be distinguished from family business advising. And as you know from reading the book, part of what we point back to in the history of the development during Wealth 2.0 is how those two fields have always been merged. And in some ways, as we say, family wealth advising has been the poor stepchild of the field of family business or family enterprise advising. And there are professional organizations that say we do family enterprise and family wealth is a part of that. But it's always, family business advising has always overshadowed the principles, the topics, and the elements of family wealth. Let's make an extension of that in a way that you are very familiar with because you are part of the Ultra High Net Worth Institute. Looking at the 10 domains model, there is no top-level domain in the taxonomy that we created for family business. And many people are surprised at that. Where's family business? Family business is a way that the domains are organized. But as I have often talked about related to the 10 domains model, family business is neither necessary nor sufficient for having family wealth. At the ultra high net worth level, very often the most common way to create wealth is through a family business. But there are people who have significant wealth never having had a family business. And there are people who had a family business long ago, got out of that business, and are managing the wealth now. And so it is neither necessary nor sufficient. And part of what we say in the book is it's time that family wealth stand on its own 2 feet and be recognized as a field in and of itself that relates to family enterprise, but is not identical to it.
Why is it different?
One of the most common topics is about wealth in relationships. And you've known me for a very long time, more than around 20 years, perhaps. I don't know, if I think back. I remember talking with you sitting at the book mill in Montague and describing to you about immigrants and natives and all of that topic at a very enjoyable conversation. That must have been like 2005 or something.
That was a long time ago.
Yeah. One of the most common topics I have always gotten as a psychologist has been about issues of parenting and wealth in relationships. How do I manage disclosure that I am wealthy, where my family comes from and stuff? That's independent of the fact of if you have a famous name associated with a family business. There's a lot of people who deal with the issue of wealth and relationships that has nothing to do with being a family business. So that's one example. And as we discuss in the book, there are far fewer practitioners who really understand how to approach and address that and help families with that, compared to the number of practitioners who can help you with family boards and ownership issues and governance set up in a family enterprise.
And I would imagine the family business consulting is more along management consulting lines versus the family wealth consultant is more understanding the family dynamics, more wealth advising. So there is a distinction in their perspective when they're sitting down with the client.
Absolutely. That even just with what you said about family dynamics, this magnetic pull back towards, if you're in the business with your brother or your father or your mother or your sister, what are the family dynamics of business families and whatever? And it very often will just go right to that, compared to people who have no experience or interest in that, who say, actually, we're very wealthy because of a high earning professional or whatever. And my brother and my sister are not. And we have sibling issues because we have, to use my metaphor, we live in land of wealth and they don't. And the jealousies, the issues of loans and gifts, my parents who say, your sister has never really found her way in the world, can't you take care of her? When in actuality, she has an overspending problem and a variety of other behaviors. So what we really are trying to emphasize is time that family wealth advising, with its complexity, its particular set of domains, be recognized as a professional field requiring expertise and skills of its own, not just nested within family business consulting or advising.
I'm curious as to how you think this negative aspect of this message has pervaded and drowned out the positive message. And that's through portrayal of wealth in society. And let's face it, fear is good for sales. And that's definitely been, certainly has entwined with the industry. So how do you think that those messages spread?
Joe, I think they spread for exactly the reasons you mentioned, which is it's effective. We used to have an old program trying to keep people off drugs and stuff about scared straight. Let me scare you enough to get you to do the right things. And you're right. Just like sex sells, fear sells. It's a classic sales and marketing technique. Let me scare you and then give you a solution. I think it's been effective for a couple reasons. One is, as a sales technique, it does appeal to people, and getting people scared and then offering a solution is effective. Number two, for a lot of advisors who may not know things with depth and nuance about family dynamics and other things, they basically distill down a lot of the messages to, okay, shirt sleeve to shirt sleeves, I got a solution for that. Let me do an incentive trust for the family. Let's tie the money up. That it was oversimplified into pat answers and easy solutions that in the industry, not the field, but the industry, would be seen as deliverables. Oh, I can do that thing for you and you can pay me money for it and I'll take care of you. It's a solution. The third element, though, I think is important for us to discuss. It taps into something that is a core issue, particularly for Generation 1, G1, wealth creators. There's an inherent anxiety in immigrants to wealth, as we talk about immigrants and versus natives of wealth who grew up with wealth.
Could you briefly describe that?
The immigrants and natives? Dennis Jaffe and I, in recognizing almost 20 years ago that the demographics of wealth indicate 80% plus or minus of people who are wealthy grew up in a lower economic class and came to that wealth in their lifetime, it struck us that actually they have many characteristics of being immigrants coming from a greater land of adversity and difficulty and scarcity, and migrating to a land of more abundance and perhaps ease. And so the first generation wealthy are like immigrants to wealth. Also, people who marry into the family and come in from, say, middle class general society are immigrants to wealth. But G2 and G3 who grow up with wealth are natives of the proverbial land of wealth. They're not immigrants. This is the land of their birth. So that's the immigrants and natives metaphor. If you grow up without money and then after working very hard, you finally achieve a level of security and stability and safety and abundance for your family, there's this deep concern of, will it last? Will it actually be a place that is harmful to future generations, to my offspring, if they don't know where we came from and how hard won all of this is? Will it spoil them? Entitlement, trust fund babies, all the words that we have for that. And ironically, if you're a good parent, you worry about your kids. And most G1s have this inherent worry, fear of what becoming wealthy and being wealthy in the family will do that may backfire. And what grew up in Wealth 2.0 was not just, the intent was not to capitalize on that, although in many places and for many people it became that. The idea was, it validated it. It said, actually, your fear is likely. Have I told you about short sleeves to short sleeves? Have I told you how 70% of wealth transitions fail? We had data. So the fear was cemented and validated as true and likely, probable. And so therefore, let's work really hard to see if we can possibly escape that. The book describes the shaky foundation for all of those proofs and basically says, look, it's understandable that you're afraid. Fears are not outcomes. We have to stop telling people their fears are likely. We need to understand people's anxieties. But we need to say, let's talk about, first of all, how much do you really have evidence that it is coming true in your family? And we can talk there about things like confirmation bias and what people pay attention to. But the bigger thing is saying, yes, it is important to do family communication, to work together, to prepare people, to have money skills and whatever, but do so not because you're driven by preventing a disaster. Do it because it's simply the right thing to do. Do it with purpose.
So let's dig into a little bit, because it's a very interesting history. There's a great deal of literature in the space, but there are some issues with it. Obviously, one of the precursors for this book was the work you did on the famous John Ward study. John Ward was studying the failure rate of family businesses. He was trying to figure out a base rate. There wasn't much research out there at the time. He was very upfront with the fact that the data he had was pretty awful, but he just essentially wanted to get people interested in researching the space. The problem is there was a statistic in his study, which was pulled out of the study and repeated endlessly, that family business, I think it was 70% or whatever it is, family businesses fail. Everybody ignored everything else that Ward had said in his introduction to it. He said, listen, this is the beginning of our research in the industry. And everybody was basically like, no, that's fine. We'll just take that number and we'll just run with it. And that's essentially what happened.
You've done a great job of synthesizing that and emphasizing that Ward himself was very responsible about it, but people took and ran with the headline numbers in such a way. And in the modern era, particularly with the internet, it is the echo chamber where whenever an editor gives a journalist an assignment to do an article about family wealth or family business, they go to Google and they type in family wealth, and up comes the only 30% of businesses survive through the second generation, 13% survive through the third, and they put it at the lead of the article because fear sells, and then they go from there. And the next journalist comes along, Googles it, and perpetuates it. And so, yes, that was one of the most basic research studies that, particularly in America and the Western world, we love data. If you can give me a number, a statistic, then that means it's true. And what we now are really looking back on saying, wait a minute, if you really look at that study, it's very limited, very circumscribed set of results, and it's been taken way out of context. We got to stop talking about that.
One of the issues for a practitioner is that the research that we get, the studies that we read, come from different places, and they all have their pros and cons. So they come from academia, they come from asset management, they come from now private companies, which are dedicated to doing wealth research. But all of these studies have their own biases, and it makes it very difficult for the practitioner to actually know what is real and useful. What do you think about the literature and the research in the space?
You've put your finger on one of the main concerns and complaints we've had about Wealth 2.0, the very limited and often not very applicable research. And as you know from the book, one of the core elements of Wealth 3.0 that we talk about is the fundamental need, finally, to have decent research that should be part of a professional field. As you say, and again, going back to where we began in this podcast, the difference between the industry and the field. A professional field has good research so that people know what they're saying and can back it up, and clients can have confidence that what they're being told is grounded in some element of reality and truth. We don't have a lot of that, particularly around family wealth.
Why doesn't academia do a good job of that?
Several reasons why academia has been really limited. And I'll just list some bullet points here. One is psychology as a field has abandoned money and wealth issues for largely its entire history. There is no division devoted to it in the American Psychological Association. A lot of psychologists have biases about money and wealth, and it's an empty chair at the table. And psychologists actually know quite a bit about good research design. So the absence of the field contributing has had an impact. Another one is stereotyping and bias. When research has been done, it's often been invaded by negative stereotypes about the wealthy. There are some psychologists who invariably, in any study they do, will prove that rich people are terrible. 3, as you say, the industry has done the research, not academic areas. And so the industry looks for short-term results. The one area that academia needed to do research in that's a glaring omission is longitudinal studies, following wealthy families over a period of time to actually find out what happens. And the short-term thinking of family business schools, the focus on family business versus family wealth, the absence in academia of people doing solid research design, all these various things have led to our current state.
So the book has one provocative line which jumped out to me, which I'm going to paraphrase. This new paradigm redefines the benefit of wealth as developing skills for enhancing life and increases options, even if the wealth is dissipated in the process. I'm not sure I've ever seen that before. So wealth management is not primarily about holding on to the money anymore. And I've obviously heard this from other places as well, but I'm interested in how you arrived at that place.
Joe, that is probably one of the most important parts of the entire book. It actually relates to what we just talked about, research. The measure of success for wealthy families in Wealth 1.0 and 2.0 has been, does the wealth last? If you come back at G3 or G4 or G5, is the family still wealthy? That is the outcome measure for everything. And Dennis Jaffe and Kristin Keffeler and I wanted to really question that and say, wait a minute, success or failure hasn't to do with does the money last? It has to do with the character of the family, because there are some families who could quite legitimately and purposefully decide that they were going to use their resources for the benefit of educating family members, philanthropy, funding businesses for other people, other sorts of things that ultimately could bring the family out of the wealth population down to upper middle class or even middle class. And that still would be a very successful outcome. The measure really cannot be, did they keep the money? Because then it's about success of the money, not success of the family.
How does that clash with the deep psychological need to build a dynasty, to build a family, to build a house, an institution?
It's funny that you say that because let me tell you a story. The punchline of the story is basically not everybody does want to build a dynasty. There are a lot of wealth creators who scratch their heads over that. Dennis Jaffe and I were talking years ago to a well-known peer support organization of the wealthy. And we were talking about the 100-Year Family Project, which you are familiar with, and we've discussed in a prior podcast, where the study looked at those families who have survived through at least 2 generational transitions and done well. We were talking about this, and then we had a Q&A period, and one guy, a little tentatively, but bravely, put his hand up and he said, "Why would I want to be a 100-year family?" And it was a great question, a very thoughtful question, because and part of what he said was, I worked really hard. We built this money. I'm really happy for my family, but we're going to enjoy it. And if it goes away, that's all right. My kids can make their own. And so not everybody wants to create a dynasty. And ironically, he was onto something, which is exactly why we wrote that in the book now, which is families need to be able to make their own choices for the outcome they want for the family. And if you use the resources of the family to enhance the family, to teach skills, to create people who are more able to live in the world successfully, it's not about the money.
How do you think we've come to a place in the culture where that is something you can talk about?
Well, that's another good point, Joe. First of all, for many families, the concerns over wealth and equality are quite powerful. And so the idea of preserving wealth for their family indefinitely is not necessarily the best approach, that they would rather improve wealth equality, make opportunities for others. But again, changing the people in the family to have more skills, be more effective in the world, have good careers, that may be a better, and for some families, more noble outcome than just cherishing the money and keeping it going. We could spend a lot of time talking about how general society views the wealthy, the pros and cons, the issues, sometimes the stereotypes, but the whole social aspect of wealth in society.
But if we go, let's take that down to the individual level. As a psychologist, what are your thoughts on the need to preserve status for the individual and how they extend that out into the future?
It's funny. Again, I would change your question with a little bit of wording, which is similar to how you said the last one. For some, perhaps more people than we think, it's not a need, it's a desire. There's a lot of complicated research, and particularly with changing demographics in the modern world, there may not, for everybody, be a fundamental need to maintain status. There are, in fact, research studies that show different patterns of money personalities and other things that indicate that some people actually do not have an interest in maintaining status. They are more altruistic, other sorts of things. I think we're moving from this idea that when people become wealthy, they want to hold on to it. They lose empathy. They want to perpetuate themselves. They only think about their own family. For a lot of people in the modern world, that's changing, and that's a good thing.
So how can families and advisors shift from a fear-based mindset to one of engagement and growth?
Oh, great question. Again, in the book, we talk about there's not enough attention paid to what is really an intermediate step between the fear and the outcome. Remember, I mentioned about how a normal anxiety about parents is wanting their children and grandchildren to turn out well and to have good, strong, responsible skills, things like that. And the fear is the money will demotivate them, take that all away. And so you got to keep the fear in order to prevent that from happening. What we talk about is there is an intermediate step, which is fear creates vigilance. You stay alert. If you're afraid something's going to happen, you're alert to the possibility it's starting to develop. And that actually you can keep the vigilance while not having to have the drumbeat of fear. For a family to talk together, to do family meetings, to work together to build skills, and to share a normal and healthy level of vigilance to how people in the family are doing is actually the active ingredient. And a family can do that with purpose and togetherness, with strengths and resilience. You can keep the vigilance. It does not have to be driven because you're afraid.
So you've really captured a particular moment here. The book is definitely also a call to action, but I'm curious if you think it's corrective or evolutionary.
I would think it's probably a little bit of both. I think the book is a call to action. It's a little bit of a manifesto and a concern over some of the negative ways that Wealth 2.0 has gone. But it also is capturing something. We're not creating Wealth 3.0. We just saw it and have labeled it and named it. We put a name to a movement that has already been occurring for maybe since 2015 or plus or minus. I think it's part of the natural evolution and maturation of a professional field. Most professional fields start off in the way that 2.0 began. A lot of dynamism, radical new ideas, research, which then in retrospect turns out to be not so great. If you look at the field of psychology, for example, psychodynamic ideas and psychoanalysis were absolutely groundbreaking. And then we found out that there may be other ways to think about things. I think this is more akin to what happens in families themselves. We often talk about G2 or G3 having the task of professionalizing the family. A lot of things get started in G1 that have to get professionalized and structures created, a solid foundation created. To me, I think this is just a normal maturation of the field itself and a movement into the next phase of its development, which is going to be wonderful in what it creates.
What are your thoughts on the current credentials offered in this space? There's been programs that many folks offer, and for many years. Are they valuable?
I think that they're valuable. My concern is that they're splintered. They're bits and pieces. People have tried to create modules here and there. It has not been a coordinated effort. And interestingly, what we are finding since I began talking about 3.0 4 years ago is that has really captured the interest of organizations to begin creating credentialing, education, and training in a scalable, solid way to turn out more practitioners, because part of it is quality control. It's been a kind of a cottage industry and a guild, and we need to have credentialing, education, and training as a professional organization that is much more solid. So I think many of the initiatives in parts of the field that we are going to, that we have benefited from have been wonderful. And I think that they're going to grow in the future. But what 3.0 is trying to encourage is having all of these coalesce and turn into something that people can count on as a pipeline into and through the field.
Okay, Jim. So now I'm on board with Wealth 3.0, but how am I going to work with the team of advisors who are still Wealth 2.0? And as we mentioned in our pre-talk, at the end of the day, it's the lawyer who controls the trust document. And if that person is Wealth 2.0, then a lot of this will have been in vain.
I'm thinking about, again, what you said and how you phrased it and the whole issue. One of the realities of these periods of time in professional fields is also it's a period of disruption and sometimes of tension and conflict. I was speaking with really brilliant head of a multifamily office a year or two ago about this. And he is very much a Wealth 3.0 kind of leader. And he has helped build a firm in that direction. And he said, this is a real problem. And now that we have a shorthand for this, people will understand. What do you do if you're a Wealth 3.0 firm with 2.0 clients or 2.0 advisors on your staff? What if you're a 2.0 firm with a few 3.0 advisors? What do you do if you are, to your point, a Wealth 2.0 advisor and you have a 3.0 client who wants some new things? So I think we have been, and we are moving even further into an era that sometimes is going to have some clashes to it. But I think that's healthy for, and again, we come back full circle now, it's healthy for the field and it's going to be healthy for the industry.
But do you have any granular advice for how you would talk to your Wealth 2.0 colleagues?
I already am. We have faced skepticism, pushback. One person described to me, I still want to be able to say shirt sleeve to shirt sleeves to some of my clients. And it's okay. You can do that. That's all right. You may find it goes differently than you thought, but that's okay. I'm not going to take that away from you. This is a time in which minds sometimes change slowly. People are going to be cautious. Some people are embracing it right away. Others may never. That is natural to the evolution of the field. And I think it's going to take years to have 3.0 really fully gain traction, but that's okay.
Dr. James Grubman is one of the authors of the book Wealth 3.0, along with Dennis Jaffe and Kristin Keffeler. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jim.
Thank you for having me, Joe. Great conversation.
Thanks for listening. If you like the podcast, please share it with your friends and take a minute to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. We appreciate it.